Hi, my name is Jennifer Bloss, and I am a Master of Public Health student with a concentration in Global Health at Liberty University. For my practicum, I went to Guatemala to work with the problem of malnutrition. Guatemala suffers from very high rates of malnutrition, especially a form of chronic malnutrition called stunting. This is especially prevalent in rural indigenous villages, many of which suffer from extreme poverty and the consequences of poverty. Malnutrition can have lasting effects on the health and well-being of a child throughout the rest of their life. Next slide. The purpose of this project was to improve the delivery of 2 community education programs in rural Guatemala through the writing of program training manuals for the organization Medical Teams International, or MTI. The programs had been developed and implemented, but not organized or documented. Most of the knowledge and experience of these programs just existed with the staff members who were working on the projects, and the training plans were disorganized. The programs were scheduled to be handed over to the Guatemalan Ministry of Health in a few months, but that would have been impossible to do without the proper documentation. So I worked on these 2 projects. One was called Mother Counselors, and the other was called Talleres Hogareños. And the Mother Counselor program is a type of community health worker program based on the care group model, where women are elected from within their own communities, and they then learn key messages about health and nutrition from an MTI staff member once a month, and then each woman goes and teaches her own group of 8 to 10 women the same key messages. In this way, an entire community can be reached with these key health messages. And then the second program was Talleres Hogareños, which is a nutrition recovery program for underweight children. And it's 10 days where mothers come and they learn how to prepare nutritious recipes that will help their child gain weight, as well as principles like active feeding and also key messages about health and hygiene and nutrition. These 2 programs targeted women with children under 2 years of age because that is the most critical window in which nutrition interventions can prevent harm to growth, development, and cognitive abilities of a child. Next slide. The objectives of this project were to identify best practices in both programs, discover deficiencies in training and areas for improvement in order to enhance the program prior to handoff, discover and document current staff knowledge and experience, and gather the training materials for both programs, and then finally put it all together into a training manual for each program. Next slide. So this program took place over 6 weeks in Chicaman municipality in Guatemala. And the overall goal was really to understand how these programs ran and the startup process and implementation process, everything to know for that. So this was done by focus groups and interviews, which was a really large part of how I got my information. I interviewed and did focus groups with MTI staff, with mother counselors and community volunteers, as well as some of the program participants. And then I also did field observations, so I got to go out into the villages and watch these programs in action and how they ran to get a better understanding of what was going on. And I also did literature review. These programs were based on a few source documents, and I reviewed these to make sure that the major concepts were being followed as recommended, and also define some best practices for program administration. Next slide. So my results and outcomes were really what I discovered about how these programs worked, because that's what I had to put into the training manuals. More than 40 best practices were identified in the areas of nutrition, feeding, hygiene, teaching, program design, and implementation. I found a couple very important themes, and one of which was simplicity and repetition, focused on a few key messages. And this was important because the women in these villages, most could not read or write, and so the health messages could not be overly complicated or detailed. So, visual aids like flip charts and posters were really important, as well as sometimes even things like songs to remember. And they would repeat these messages once a year in the Mother Counselor program or in the second week of the Talleres Hogareños program in order to reinforce these concepts. Another important theme I found was cultural competency and community involvement was super important. To increase buy-in and support, the community leaders needed to approve these programs prior to implementation, and the communities elected their own mother counselors using specific criteria. Also, community assessment was really important prior to implementation because we need to know the cultural norms and behavioral norms in the communities, what resources they did or did not have, as well as what are the normal types of food in these areas. I also identified a few challenges and how MTI overcame them in their implementation. And one of these that was really important was the need for mentorship during the Mother Counselor program. Many of the Mother Counselors wanted MTI staff to be present at all of their replicas or their trainings, but that was not possible. So they set up a system of mentorship that paired more experienced Mother Counselors with newer ones for support. And this was very effective and empowered the community to help themselves from within. Overall, I got a very comprehensive look at program design and program administration in resource-limited environments. Next slide. So some of the accomplishments were the production of 2 training manuals, one for each program, and both were written in Spanish and English to allow for use by a wider audience. And each manual can guide an organization through initiation and implementation of these programs in a new community, including lesson plans and evaluation forms. These manuals are complete collections that could open the door for other organizations to start these programs in new communities, which could impact the prevalence of malnutrition in Guatemala over time. Also, accomplishments for navigating the language and cultural challenges. I do speak some intermediate Spanish, and a few people did speak English, but many of my other supervisors and MTI staff did not, and the women in the villages only spoke my indigenous languages. So this experience required a lot of observation and nonverbal communication and finding tools and creativities in order to get things done. Next slide. So I had a couple recommendations, and one that I touched on before was community approval and relationship building is foundational when you are implementing projects in another country or culture. They want to know that you're genuine and dedicated and want to support them, and relationships must be built to gain trust and access. Additionally, education before projects was a really interesting finding that I recommend. And MTI found that if a Mother Counselor program or another education program was implemented after or at the same time, the community was also receiving things like water collection systems or latrines or safe stoves, the community had less interest in the educational component. So now it is recommended that a Mother Counselor program or another educational program should be in place for at least 1 year before bringing in the fancier interventions. That way the community has the correct foundation for using them appropriately and is already invested in the education. Next slide. So a couple things I found during reflection was just how the empowerment of women was an amazing secondary effect of implementing these programs. Mother counselors I talked to mentioned how grateful they were for their new knowledge that allowed them to now be champions of health for their families and their neighbors. And additionally, one mother counselor told me that her husband originally did not want her going to these trainings and didn't support it. But after he had seen what she's doing in the community and the other women, now he is in full support of her and the program. And if I were to do this again, one thing I would have liked to have done differently was just have the opportunity to interview more of the program participants and the mother counselors. This would have just given me a better idea of what their real opinions were of the program, if they thought it was making a difference in the community, and if there were any barriers to implementing this new knowledge. That would be useful to know so you can change the program or overcome those. And that is everything. I hope you got a good understanding of what my practicum project was. Thank you for watching this presentation.